Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 1 o'clock session, Integrating EJ at the Highest Levels, the new federal EJ. My name is Matt Tomlinson, and I'll be your host behind the scenes this afternoon for this session. And before we get started, I'm going to go over some housekeeping slides for you. Just want to remind everyone that all lines are muted during the webinar session, and that's the case for all these sessions. And we are also recording all of these sessions. So once we have those recording links compiled, we'll be able to share those with you. You have the ability to submit questions to us, and you can do that a couple of different ways. In your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen, you can use the question or the Q&A dialog box and submit questions that way. And you can also use the Whova app if you are logged into that on a mobile device or your desktop. You can submit questions through that, and we will try to get to those at appropriate breaks. And we will provide the copies of those questions to our presenters. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for this session, and that is going to be Regina. So Regina, come on in and take it away.
Thanks, Matt. I am happy this afternoon to kick off our first session after the lunch hour on EJ at the highest levels. And so we're joined by a great panel of folks to really be able to talk about from their vantage point, how is environmental justice being prioritized? And so I want to start out by thanking everyone who is on the panel for joining us. We have Kyle White, who is a part of the White House Advisory Council on Environmental Justice, joining us. And he is also with the University of Michigan, formerly of Michigan State University. Not that I'm biased, but I'll throw that in. Sylvia O'Donnell, who's also part of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council through the EPA, and Alan Waltz, who leads the Environmental Justice Office for Region 5 of the EPA. So Alan, I am going to start off with you and just ask you a little bit about how Region 5 and EPA overall, how are you prioritizing environmental justice?
Thank you, Regina, and thank you for inviting me here today. And it's really great to be on this panel, talk about this really exciting work. It was so inspiring to hear my administrator this morning talking about how this is the moment to end environmental justice. And the real question then is how we go about that. We're being very intentional at both the national and the regional level to make sure we're doing things that are really meaningful and transformative. At the national level, there's the equity executive order that has enabled us to set up 6 work groups under our agency equity team that are currently assessing barriers to advancing equity in our work, and will then be looking at ways to actually advance beyond those barriers. It's a very all-inclusive set of areas that we're looking at. We're looking at rulemaking, permitting, and licensing. We're looking at how we do research and community and citizen science. We're looking at how we do public participation and community engagement, data and access to data, which is so important in enabling communities to kind of analyze situations on their own and be able to kind of plan around that. Grants, as well as procurements and contracts. So we're looking systematically at an agency level across all of this work that is so significant and how we distribute burdens and benefits from our work, and really looking at how we can use our work in each of those areas to advance environmental justice and advance racial equity. In particular, within Region 5, we're also undergoing, as we participate in those national work groups and identify those longer term barriers and opportunities that will inform our planning over the coming years, we're looking for those opportunities that are available to us right now. We're looking for things that we can do right now, every day, to get better at addressing disproportionate impacts and get better at really meaningfully engaging the communities that we serve. So in particular, enforcement is a very significant area where we've got a great deal of discretion, ability to focus our attention where the need is greatest. And as the administrator mentioned earlier, it's very important that we strengthen the enforcement of these cornerstone environmental statutes, as well as our civil rights laws, so that we can really address the overburdens of pollution in a meaningful way. So that means having more of a presence, doing more compliance monitoring in overburdened communities, resolving any non-compliance that we find through remedies that as much as possible deliver tangible benefits to the community, increasing engagement with communities about enforcement cases that most directly impact them, sharing information, that the data and transparency is very important. One specific project that I've been involved in with our enforcement division is our work in the East St. Louis area in Centerville. It's really focused on addressing chronic sanitary sewer overflow issues that have been occurring in residential areas for many years. And we've seen an unprecedented investment with the state of Illinois to understand and address those issues comprehensively. And our commitment to transparency is shown in the website that we have, where we post all of our public investigatory documents, everything that we can share about the work that we're doing in Centerville and the Metro East area. So that's one concrete example of how we're really trying to walk the talk right now, do the work that needs to be done, communicate about that work, engage the community on that work. Let me stop there because I don't want to take up too much time in this dialogue, but I think that's one of the most important areas. I think the other thing I would flag is the massive investment in grants that's being made, because that's really what empowers our partners to kind of set their own destiny, so to speak, really advance the state of practice in collaborative problem solving and building community capacity to lead on environmental justice issues of concern, as well as partnering with our states. It's, for example, the State Environmental Justice Cooperative Agreement that we have in Southwest Detroit is an example of that kind of investment. So significantly more investments coming on those with the EJ Small Grants and the Collaborative Problem Solving Cooperative Agreements both open for application through June 1st. So I encourage folks to check those out.
Thank you so much for that overview. I know there's a lot going on, and I know you and I talk and collaborate and try to support each other in the work and connect on communities. Can you address a little bit real quickly how important it is for us to try to work together so that we are really having an impact? And you and I have had some great conversations, I think, about having impact, real impact in communities by making sure we have that connection and synergy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Regina. Yeah, I mean, there's no way that we can respond to community calls for environmental justice unless we are working as a team to meet those calls for justice. We each have our own sets of tools and authorities and capabilities, but you at Eagle are on the front lines. You're sitting down and working with communities across Michigan every single day. I was, all the roundtables that you've done across the state, like that's the work at a state level that helps EPA understand where we can be of most service and what are the communities that we should be working in with Eagle. I think it's absolutely critical to this work that we build strong state and EPA partnerships around common commitments to civil rights and environmental justice. Because as this administration has really emphasized, environmental justice is really something that inherently calls for an all-of-government solution, right? If you're talking about systemic racism and other systemic barriers that have accumulated over decades with a legacy of issues to be addressed, incredibly complex, challenging issues, well, now is the time to do something about it. But if it was easy, we would have already done it. It's going to take new levels of teamwork and engagement, and really also bringing our partners such as Sylvia and Kyle and all of those folks that really work with communities, speak with and for communities to help us collectively guide those efforts, I think is absolutely essential to making that transformative change we want to see on the ground.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate you so much, and I appreciate the partnership we have and the work that we're able to do together. I want to turn to Brian Newland, who is joining us. Brian is currently hopefully I'll get your title right, Brian. He's currently the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Indian Affairs for the U.S. Department of the Interior. So that is a mouthful, which I understand because my title is a mouthful too. So really wanted to just welcome you and thank you. Brian was one of the original members of our Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. And he really was an active member of that group. And I want to thank you for that work. And he also was the president of the Bay Mills Indian community. So Brian, tell us about how the Department of Interior, first, congratulations, and tell us about how the Department of Interior is approaching environmental justice.
Well, thanks, Regina. I'm really excited to be here and glad to see you again, working from a different perspective on these issues with you guys. And the title is, my business card is like 3 pages long just to fit that title on there. It's a title only a Fed could love, but no, I'm glad to be here. We're doing a lot of things at the Department of the Interior on environmental justice, in coordination also with the White House group that's working on environmental justice as well. And this is something that Secretary Holland cares deeply about. Having grown up in a tribal community herself, she knows that tribal nations often suffer disproportionately high environmental impacts, bad environmental impacts. But she also understands, and the department understands, that tribes are unique because of their sovereign status. And in fact, tribes have legal interests and off-reservation treaty rights and cultural resources and sacred places on both federal and state public lands. And so one of the things that we're trying to do here at the Department of the Interior is to make sure that our environmental justice work accounts for the unique status of tribes, not only as stakeholder groups, but as sovereign governments with whom both the federal government and the states owe legal obligations to protect those cultural and religious rights, as well as the off-reservation treaty rights.
So thank you so much for that. So how do you see your role, particularly over Indian Affairs, as really moving forward opportunities as it relates to tribes and justice?
You mean in this context, one of the so a couple of things. One is we want to make sure that tribes have the investment in local infrastructure in tribal communities to respond to a changing climate, but also to be a part of renewable energy development and remediation in their homelands. And we also want to make sure that our environmental processes at the Department of the Interior, our NEPA process, for example, accounts for the social cost of carbon and greenhouse gases, especially as they impact tribal communities, as well as those legal rights that I just mentioned.
So from your vantage point, thank you for that. So from your vantage point, how will you take what you did in your tribe and translate that into federal policy?
Well, I think the first thing that I'm going to do, along with other folks in Indian Affairs, is to bring that perspective of what it's like actually on the ground in tribal communities. There hasn't been, it has been more than 30 years since a former elected tribal leader has served in this position, and it's only ever happened twice. And so making sure that folks across the Department of the Interior and across the federal government understand exactly what tribal governments are working with on the ground, and capabilities and practical needs is something that I'm working on because these initiatives, environmental justice, economic development, renewable energy, they're not really going to amount to a whole lot if they don't fit with what tribes need on the ground and their capabilities.
That's an important point. And, I did not realize how disconnected the department had previously been from tribes. And so that's an important perspective. Thank you so much. I'm going to switch over and ask a question, although all of you stick around because I'll get back to you. And really, I'm so excited to have both Sylvia and Kyle here from the perspective of folks serving on an advisory, in an advisory capacity at the federal level. I want to make sure that I bring Sylvia in appropriately. So I'm going to do this Orduño. I hope I did that right. So Sylvia, wanted to ask you, did I do it right?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Just wanted to get your vantage point. I mean, the White House Advisory Council is they're the new kids on the block, right? But the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council has been around for years, and you are a chair this year. And I know you also serve on the MACUJ. So can you tell me, first, historically, the role that the NEJAC has played, and second, how you see that role moving forward with the new administration?
Sure, thank you. It's a delight to be here. So yeah, NEJAC's been at this since 1993. And so I can't tell you how delighted we are to have the additional role of the WEJAC and all the other formations as we understand that they're going to be developed, and including interagency working groups. So NEJAC, as you're all familiar, is a multi-stakeholder council with representatives from the business community, from community groups, government, academia, indigenous, community organizations. And we really work to figure out how it is that we can be responsive to our communities from the organizations that we represent, the regions we represent, and then also in the variety of public meetings that we also hold. So I can tell you that like our public comments for each meeting is probably one of the most critical parts of every meeting that we hold, because we know that community members from across the country are coming forward to tell us what's happening, so that we can also better figure out how to be not just sort of like advocates with the Office of Environmental Justice and the EPA, but also so that we can also kind of connect what's happening with all of the different kinds of impacted communities. So as you know, NEJAC is largely about trying to address the cumulative impacts in impacted communities, right? So we're talking about people that are oftentimes in little to no resourced communities, financially vulnerable, politically marginalized, mostly people of color, and have been dealing with issues for, frankly, way too long, where we also are familiar with them as legacy communities. And so the work that I do, that I came into this on, has been working with Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, which is a poor people's organization. So my entry into environmental justice is kind of through the back door rather than the front door, where a lot of like air and soil advocates tend to work. The work that I do has largely been on water. And even though it's now sort of around contamination, it's largely been around issues of infrastructure and affordability, right? And so as we're doing this engagement with the EPA at the federal level, I'm appreciating what Alan was saying there too, because it's really critical that we better be able to connect what's happening at the community level with residents and the cities and state governments with our regions, because that's really sort of our touch point with the EPA. And we know that there's been a number of challenges over the years, right? We've got a lot of unevenness with our regions. And so we want to make sure that also as part of the conversations for how it is that we improve environmental justice, we're also improving the capacity of our regions to be able to address EJ issues. And so we're looking very closely now at a lot of what's been happening in past administrations. As you know, the last one wasn't too kind to environmental justice communities in particular. There were a number of rollbacks. There were a variety of interpretations, I guess you could say, in terms of how it is that there were changes in how it was that the Safe Drinking Water Act or the Clean Water Act or other environmental protections were viewed and were modified. So we're looking in particular areas right now, and we've formed a series of working groups to try to see if we can actually look at what has been done through NEJAC over the years, especially in recent years, but also what are those concerns that we continue to have that haven't been addressed by EPA. And so while we appreciate the hard work of a lot of folks that are career and appointees of the EPA, as EJ communities, we know that, again, there hasn't always been sort of the urgency of response that we needed or the adequate response. And so we're looking, for instance, at a number of issues around farm worker concerns and pesticides, PFAS and PFOA, water infrastructure, NEPA rollbacks, I mentioned, community air quality, and even sort of NEJAC's version of the Justice 40, where we're looking at issues around finance and investment, right? Because we know it matters to get the money into impacted communities so that we can do something to address the cumulative health impacts and other priorities that our EJ communities have.
Thank you for that, Sylvia. Do you see opportunities as you work, within EPA to help connect the dots with other departments at the federal level? I mean, I know that the WEJAC is looking, across the federal landscape, but because of your experience with this type of advisory council, do you see that? Do you see that as kind of a next step?
Absolutely. And one of the things that has been pretty important, but also a bit challenging in terms of how it is that we can sort of do this successfully is we're getting a lot more questions and requests for help about what does it mean to do environmental justice? How is it defined? What does it look like in the course of the kinds of questions that organizations or businesses should be asking, even across the different federal advisory committees. There are questions from participants on those different councils about how it is that they should be addressing EJ. And so the leadership, both from the president and from Administrator Regan, is so critical because they're really making clear that, look, we are going to address environmental justice, we're going to better understand it, and we're going to find ways in which we can incorporate all of the ways in which we can address long-time issues in practical ways, right? Because we want to make sure that we're doing it across how it is that it impacts other areas of the administration, different administrations, but also how it is that we can get the resources to communities. Because it doesn't really matter much if we just sort of keep talking about what would be great to have done if we don't have the money to actually make the changes.
Thank you so much for that, Sylvia. And I'm going to use that as a segue to bring Kyle into the conversation. Wanted to thank you for being here, Kyle, and hear from you a little bit about, I know you're new to the assignment of the advisory council, but not new to working on environmental justice. So I know you bring with you a lot of experience here in Michigan. So can you give a perspective first on what you see or what has been really told to you about the tasks of the White House Advisory Council on Environmental Justice, where the focus is and what you hope to be able to do as part of that body?
Thanks so much, Regina, and good to have a chance to connect with everybody here. In the chat for both panelists and attendees, I put in a link to a pretty substantive document that represents a draft of the council's most recent recommendations. And some of what I'm going to share is my opinion on what one will find when you go through that document. I encourage everybody to go through it. So just to begin with kind of a basic starting point, that Executive Order 14008, which comes from the Biden-Harris administration, established both the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, but also different from and replacing the current interagency working group on environmental justice. There's now a White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council that's made up of the leaders of the federal agencies. And so these two councils are going to be working to directly advise the White House on environmental justice policy, including decisions about the distribution of funds and the design of how funds are distributed across all federal agencies. And we first convened right at the beginning of April. We had a really tight deadline to get in recommendations on 3 major areas by May 13th, so last week. And that first set of recommendations is what I highlighted. And so our council has 26 members, and it's all folks who represent those whose work really grounds them in the perspective of particular communities that have been fighting to establish environmental justice. And we were divided into 3 work groups. One work group is focused on something that I've already heard folks refer to in this conference, which is the Justice 40 initiative. And so that's an initiative established in the 14008 executive order that says that 40% of the benefits of a pretty substantial investment portfolio in areas like clean water infrastructure, renewable energy, resilient infrastructure, 40% of the benefits of those investments have to be for communities that are affected by environmental injustice. And so that work group worked very hard to look at all the different dimensions of infrastructure investment and to figure out what it would mean for the benefits to actually genuinely accrue to communities that are facing environmental justice and equity issues. The second work group, which was the one that I was on, was looking at how to upgrade Executive Order 12898. So that's the executive order from 1994, which was one of the first environmental justice policies within the United States issued by Clinton. And so we worked really hard to find ways to try to understand why the executive order hasn't quite met its potential. And we really worked hard to find ways to reissue an executive order that would center accountability measures, and it would actually center the fact that environmental justice is about civil rights and that agencies are responsible for Title VI, that they are responsible, it's part of their job, right, is the enforcement of civil rights, among other areas I can also speak to later. And then the last work group is focused on environmental justice and climate change screening tools. And I know coming up right after this panel, I believe, is a panel with some of the experts on screening tools. And so I would encourage folks to attend that panel. This work group focused on how to create sort of the next generation of screening tools that would not only hold industries and other polluters accountable, but would also lift up ways to understand where federal investment priorities should be. So bringing together data tools, spatial analysis tools, in order both to empower communities through better targeted and prioritized investments, but also to hold agencies and polluters accountable and other perpetrators of injustice accountable to their actions.
So that sounds like a very heavy lift in a short period of time, right? You all had to really work hard to get to your recommendations by the 13th, but I know you said they are being finalized, they're out there, and are formally going to be shared soon. Can you tell me a little bit? It's interesting, you know, in looking at your role on the work group that you were on, how did you, what were some of the things that came out of how to put teeth into that previous executive order? And, what do you think of the timeline and the process and your expectation? I know there's a lot of questions all rolled into one, and your expectations moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate it, Regina, recognizing all the different things that we could discuss. And so, first of all, with regard to the reforms that we suggested that we recommended for the 1994 executive order, there's a couple of things I wanted to note. So we were very explicit that a next generation executive order, so one that I hope is going to be coming, is one that is very explicit about Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. It also has to be one that is defining environmental justice in terms of just treatment, where just treatment is about full protection for communities, right? Full protection. And we really worked hard to update the different definitions. And the people in our work group were very experienced with the frustrations of dealing with state and federal policy. And so we tried to do as much as we could in that executive order. I know many of my friends and colleagues here in Michigan know exactly what I'm talking about, to try to figure out in what ways can the executive order really put on the map for federal agencies that they need to do a much better job coordinating with states and with municipalities. Because for many of us who've been involved in environmental justice organizing, it's states and municipalities that have posed severe challenges. And so we also thought very carefully about to what degree can the executive order create more opportunities to hold states and municipalities accountable, given obviously the limits on a federal executive order. We also tried to be more fair and faithful to the actual types of impacts that many EJ communities call out. So for example, the previous executive order had very little to say about culture, especially the range of cultural impacts that different communities have said are threatening them due to pollution and other environmental stressors. And so we have a substantive inclusion of different dimensions of culture. And I know Deputy Assistant Director Newland talked about off-reservation treaty rights. And, obviously those rights have a lot to do with cultural impacts. And so we were trying to build in language and policy that would achieve those important meanings that have mattered so much for environmental justice affected communities. We were very particular about accountability measures. Agencies have to have strategic plans. There's multiple layers of reporting and accountability. We have a very clear definition of meaningful involvement and tribal consultation, which actually for us, right, we're saying it has to mean that there is an opportunity to influence decision-making. And that definition is reflected throughout the recommendations. And so really for me, in the work group I was in, so many people from different states really were having very similar, unfortunately, experiences that we've had here in Michigan. Whether that's my colleagues that are organizing in the context of the pollution burdens in Detroit 48217, whether it's the tribal community that's fighting against Enbridge Line 5, and numerous other environmental justice struggles. And I just wanted to add to that this theme of accountability and accountability measures, this was a huge part of what the Justice 40 work group did. They were very careful to define what 40% benefit means. And it has to mean investment in frontline communities, investment in tribal communities, and investment that actually matters. Because it's important to note, right, that the idea of new infrastructure investment for many of our communities, what does that mean? And I'm thinking about tribes, but this applies to many other communities too, where we have generations of backlog of infrastructure divestment. So you can't just say it's time for renewable energy when actually what first needs to happen is there needs to be road and transportation infrastructure, broadband and telecommunications infrastructure, water infrastructure. All of that needs to be coordinated. All of that needs to happen in a way that suits the particular situation of particular peoples, of particular communities. And so the Justice 40 initiative, the recommendations are pages long because they talk about all sorts of different dimensions, from finance to even how projects that aren't directly for particular communities nonetheless can't harm them and have to be shown to provide indirect benefits. So I think we've really provided an extensive roadmap, and when you put it together with the important work that the NEJAC, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, what Sylvia spoke to, has been doing, as well as a number of other efforts, it puts together a really large portfolio of information, of priorities, of values, and of particular actions that can be taken to take advantage of the opportunity right now that's before us.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing all of that, because I think you're right. Justice 40 has been referenced a few times, and you just defined it in the best way to really get people thinking about, how this is going to happen. And it sounds like a long road ahead. I want to open up and anyone can jump in and answer this question, including you, Kyle. But I know we've spent many, many years outlining the challenges that environmental justice communities face. Can you all, give me a sense of what you see as our opportunity now to move these forward? From my vantage point, I see a lot of synergy and purpose that I'd love to see turned into action. So how do we turn our collective, advocacy and voices into real action that really impacts lives moving forward? I know it's a loaded question. So, come off mute and jump in.
Well, Regina, as a public servant, I feel a particular responsibility to be able to point towards action. And I think, first I want to say, I started EPA in 1996. I've been working on environmental justice since the week I walked in the door, and NEJAC has provided so much important counsel and advice over the years. I'm really happy to hear that there's sort of a look back and kind of taking stock, because there are a lot of very good, incredible work that was done in the past, and I'm just completely awed at the scale of work that the WEJAC and NEJAC are doing now. And it's invaluable to have such great counsel and such dedicated, knowledgeable, well-informed partners to help us figure out this work. So that is number one for me, is looking to those recommendations and figuring out what can I make actionable within Region 5 EPA that is serving the Great Lakes region. I think one area that's very particular that's been touched on a couple times that I did not mention before is the intersection of environmental justice and tribal governments and tribal communities. I think is very important, and we've made a significant investment in my office. I'm honored to be able to direct the tribal program as well as the environmental justice program, and so we've had a great opportunity to pay attention to that intersection and to think about how do we advance our practice based on our government to government relationship and our trust responsibility in ways that are also focused on addressing concerns about disproportionate impacts. So that's a dialogue I really look forward to continuing with my partners, internal and external. I think that's very important. And then I think what's really critical, speaking again from a regional standpoint, that as we're preparing for these longer term strategic plans, and I really love what I'm hearing about the accountability. I think that's really important stuff. My goal is to create the processes and knowledge and collaboration space and workspace that we can hear these recommendations from our partners. We can engage in dialogue with our community partners, really understand what the priorities are, and take that information on board as we look systematically at our programs and ask, right, the same way that Kyle was just describing, the deep dive into Executive Order 12898 and what should the next generation of that look like. It strikes me as very analogous to the challenge that each region faces, which is to look systematically, not just at the low-hanging fruit and not just doing a check the box exercise, but systematically looking at how our programs practice, what their policies are, what the cultures are, all the ways that we have of doing business, and finding ways to create improvements, not just improvements that are sort of like, okay, now we have an EJ policy. It really does go to results and accountability, right? It goes to fair treatment or just treatment. I think that's actually a much better term for us to be using, because it reflects that we have to move towards justice. Just treatment means that we have to actually get better at identifying and addressing disproportionate impacts. We need more scientific tools. We need more policy tools. We just need to build that practice. That's a critical area of investment. And that's a big part of what gets our change on the ground. That's a big part of what say our enforcement program can use when they're trying to decide where they should focus their attention. The other really big piece of that I'm so happy to hear the discussion on as well is meaningful involvement. How do we actually not just talk to, but engage and sit down with community advocates, leaders, and members, the folks who are best positioned to really help us understand what justice looks like. And so that our decisions, as we apply our new program tools, our new policies, our new ways of doing business, so that our decisions are informed as much as possible by not just the evidence of disproportionate impacts that they bring to our attention, but by the aspirations and visions for community flourishing and well-being that we really, right, the reason to deal with all these legacy issues, all these barriers, is to enable us to move forward together with a vision of every community flourishing and fulfilling its own intended greatest good, with no barriers to that associated with factors that really have nothing to do with community well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And I share your passion around that. You know, Alan and I can spend hours just trying to figure the world out. Are there other comments?
Can I just follow up on that point though, Regina?
Yes.
And I appreciate all that you laid out there, Alan, because I think that this is where it comes down to how we actually make it happen. How do you get that accountability? What does the accountability look like? We regularly hear from folks on the ground, right, about capacity and even just basic information sometimes. And so part of this whole process for how it is that we deliver, even if we're just talking specifically on Justice 40, is what does it look like, right? Because in many ways, we still operate in a kind of trickle down way. We've got to figure out how to sort of make sure that impacted communities, impacted residents in the neighborhoods, on the streets, are getting the information that they need to be able to acquire the resources to be able to make those changes in their communities, in their lives, right? And there's a lot of layers in between, right? Between DC and Detroit. And so I think as we're talking about how do we do this in Michigan, how do we do this in Region 5, we really have to start saying, all right, what are some of the impediments to actually making it so that impacted communities can get that voice, can have that space for their own self-determination and get the resources that they need.
Thank you.
If
Sylvia.
I could,
yeah.
if Sylvia, that's a great point, and to build on what you and Alan said is, one of the things that we do at the Department of the Interior and federal government with tribal consultation is our policies require that it be meaningful. It's explicitly, that word is in the policy, and in order to be meaningful, that means that we have to engage before the policy is actually made and executed. And so, while there's a special legal relationship with tribes that mandates that can also be replicated with stakeholders in affected communities on any issue. And that's really at its core is about a people connecting with their government and having a say in how these policies are developed. So whether it's a state agency or a federal agency, making sure that the people who are impacted by the decisions have a hand in shaping those decisions. And in terms of, lastly, Regina, about how do you turn these, these discussions into action? I've been on all sides of this with as a federal government official, a tribal, local government official, tribal government official, and an advocate. And advocates really drive this work. And the best ideas aren't generated within the government. Effective government actors take good ideas from the advocacy community and give them space to be put into action and empower people to put those into action. And so for those of you who are participating in this conference and listening right now, keep up your advocacy, keep up your pressure, and provide that roadmap to policymakers to get to where you want to go.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that, Brian. That's a really good point and a good perspective. As Sylvia knows, I hear from my advocate friends all the time, and it makes you think creatively, right? Because there is no easy roadmap. There is no, if there's a reason the word bureaucracy matters, right? Because there are so many layers in government. I come from an advocacy background as well, and having that perspective of how to navigate that is challenging. I mean, Alan, you've been at this. You might be the old head, as they say, in terms of, you know, the thinking around how to move this forward. So I believe we're at time. I think we got the 4-minute quite a long time ago. So I want to thank my panel, Kyle, Alan, Sylvia, Brian. I'm not using formal titles right now. Thank you for your perspectives. If you have a question in the chat, we will answer those as a follow-up. And thank you. Please join us for our next session on the environmental justice screening tool that we're working on here in Michigan and why it matters. Everybody have a great afternoon, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Oh, and last shout out, if you want to talk about community capacity building, look up the Ohio Environmental Justice Academy, because that's what the model is that we're trying to invest in. So check that out, Sylvia.